When a little boy begged his school bus driver to let him stay in the bus overnight, the driver initially thought that the boy was just a young child looking for an adventure. However, after he noticed the boy's jumpy and scared demeanor, and saw a bruise peeking out from under the boy's sleeve, he realized that something sinister and evil was going on in the little boy's home. With the boy's safety hanging in the balance, a race against time began as the boy's teacher, the school bus driver, and a determined social worker rushed to save him before it was too late. This was a story of bravery, resilience, and the relentless fight for justice. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from, and, if you believe the truth should always come to light, be sure to like and subscribe for more. The school day at Stratford Academy had ended under a blanket of heavy, low-hanging clouds that threatened rain. The sun struggled to push its muted glow through the haze, coating the school grounds in a somber shade of gray. The hallway floors, still riddled with scuff marks from the day's foot traffic, echoed with the last fading conversations of students and teachers heading home. Most of them appeared delighted that the final bell had rung, and they hurried away without a second thought. Yet, there was one figure who walked alone at a slower pace, shoulders slumped, eyes downcast. That was Ethan, a small, 9-year-old boy whose timid demeanor attracted little notice on most days. But on this particular afternoon, a few people would start to see him for who he really was, a child caught in a silent storm of secrets and fear. Ethan's hair was a sandy brown, cut neatly above his ears in a style that suggested his foster mother liked to keep up appearances. On first glance, someone might have considered him unremarkable, just another quiet boy with a backpack, slipping in and out of classrooms without attracting attention. However, beneath this surface lay bruises he hid beneath long sleeves. No one really saw them unless they looked closely, but they were there all the same, painting a picture of distress that few had paused to notice. That afternoon, as the rumble of the school buses revving up filled the parking lot, Ethan hesitated on the curb. He had a habit of hovering right where the sidewalk ended, as though he was afraid to put one foot forward. He watched the other kids rush toward the large yellow buses that were lined up, ready to take them home. He felt a tightness in his chest each time someone brushed by him. He wondered if any of those students could tell how scared he was just by looking at him. Did they sense how desperately he wanted to vanish, or how badly he dreaded going back to the house where he was expected to live? Before he could dwell too long on his worries, the bus driver, whose name was Oliver Grant, called out to him. Oliver was in his late 40s, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair under a baseball cap that had long since faded from countless sunny afternoons. He had gentle eyes, though, and most of the kids liked him for his warm smile and friendly demeanor. "Hey there, kid," Oliver said as Ethan tentatively stepped onto the bus. "You okay? You look a bit pale." Ethan managed a nod, too faint to be genuine, and shuffled past. He found a seat near the middle, where he could blend in but still feel somewhat protected by the driver's presence at the front. Even that small detail, choosing a seat, felt like a balancing act. Sitting too far in the back made him feel isolated. Sitting too close to the front would draw attention he wasn't ready to handle. When the bus roared out of the school parking lot, Ethan kept his eyes on the window, counting the houses and streets, dreading that final stop where he would have to get off. The day had felt endless, yet it ended too soon because, in his mind, the moment he stepped through his foster parents' front door, the threats waiting there eclipsed any small comfort he might have gained from a day at school. Greg and Melissa Harper always smiled in public. They were quick with polite nods and friendly small talk if they encountered a teacher or a neighbor. But Ethan knew that behind the closed door, that politeness vanished in an instant whenever he failed to meet their standards or simply got on Greg's nerve. He never knew which version of them he would face at the end of each day. The bus continued its journey, stopping at various residential streets. Kids poured out in clusters, some waving at Oliver before racing off to their homes. The seats slowly emptied until, finally, Ethan realized he was the last one left. It was unusual, but Oliver didn't rush him. Instead, He glanced back with curiosity. "Hey buddy," Oliver said, leaning slightly to the side to see Ethan in his mirror. "You sure you're feeling all right? Where's your stop?" Ethan's stop had been passed already, which both of them knew. Oliver had expected Ethan to say something or pull the cord to indicate he needed off. Yet, Ethan hadn't even moved from his seat. Ethan swallowed hard and fidgeted with the frayed hem of his backpack strap. I don't want to go home," he murmured, his voice trembling more than he intended. Oliver turned off the engine. With the bus now idle, he stood and walked down the aisle until he was a few seats behind Ethan. "What's going on, little man?" Oliver asked, gentle worry etching into his features. "Can you tell me why you don't want to go back?" Ethan's lower lip quivered. He remembered his foster father's warning, the menacing expression on Greg's face when Ethan once talked about home to a friend at school. That friend had asked how life was, and Ethan had confessed that he got scared sometimes. In less than a day, the words had somehow reached Melissa's ears, and Ethan paid for it with harsh punishments that left him trembling at night. He had learned to keep quiet. He had learned to lie or hide or do anything he could to keep the peace, even if it was all a facade. Now, faced with Oliver's kindness, he felt torn between the fear of telling the truth and the desperation for someone to notice it. "I just can't," Ethan whispered. He tugged his sleeve down, but Oliver had already glimpsed a dark bruise creeping out from under the fabric, circled around the thin wrist like a sinister cuff. Oliver's breath caught in his throat. It reminded him of something he had seen before. Long ago, he had once driven a community center bus and had come across a kid in a similarly dire situation. But that was years before. He had never really forgotten that face, nor the quiet heartbreak that accompanied the realization that some children had nowhere safe to go. "Ethan, you can tell me," Oliver said as he lowered his voice, scanning Ethan's arm. "We can figure this out. Let's call your teacher or someone we can trust. We'll make sure you're okay." Ethan's eyes widened in alarm, tears pooling at the corners of his lashes. "No, please," he said, gripping the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'll get in trouble, and it'll only make it worse." Oliver's heart sank. He carefully reached out, but Ethan recoiled, as if expecting another blow. The man raised his hands in a calming gesture. "Nobody's going to hurt you while I'm around, you hear me?" Oliver said with quiet determination. "But I can't just leave you out here alone either." Ethan looked like he might start sobbing at any moment, but no tears fell. Instead, he pressed his lips together and swallowed his fear. His voice, when he managed to speak, was as fragile as a brittle leaf about to crumble. Can I stay in the bus tonight?" he asked, the words so faint that Oliver had to lean closer to catch them. Oliver was momentarily speechless. It wasn't a request a child made unless something was terribly wrong at home. "Stay here?" he repeated, just to be sure he had heard correctly. Then he saw the desperation in Ethan's face. The earlier suspicion that there was real trouble, not just a child's whim, now crystallized into certainty. Oliver slid into the seat across from Ethan. He wanted to show that he wasn't looming over the boy or cornering him. He spoke gently. "I'm worried about you," he said, his voice soft. "But if you stay in the bus, what happens tomorrow? And what about tonight? It's going to get cold. We need to let someone know." Ethan just shook his head in silence. Oliver, troubled by the boy's fear, realized that he needed to talk to someone at the school. He remembered that Ms. Delaney, one of the teachers, had always shown special concern for Ethan. And there was also Mr. Carson, the physical education teacher who had a knack for connecting with kids who were hurting. Oliver had seen him approach Ethan once or twice, offering an encouraging word when Ethan struggled in gym class. Maybe, Oliver reasoned, they would know how to handle this. He knew enough not to drive Ethan back to that house. At least, not until an adult who had the power to intervene could be consulted. Oliver picked up his phone, glancing from Ethan to the battered device, clearly debating if he should call the police or someone else. His first thought was to reach out to the school counselor or a social worker. He remembered Ms. Rowan, the newly assigned social worker to Stratford Academy, who had introduced herself to all the staff at the beginning of the school year. "It'll be okay," Oliver assured Ethan, giving him a tentative smile. "Let me call someone who can help." Ethan stared at him, and for a brief moment there was something resembling hope in his eyes. But that hope was tangled in layers of fear, as if he was sure that the moment he breathed a word of the truth, something terrible would happen to him. Oliver dialed Ms. Delaney's number. She was one of the teachers who often stayed late to grade papers or prepare for the next day's lessons. Sure enough, she picked up right away, and Oliver explained that he had Ethan with him on the bus, long after his stop, and that the boy seemed too frightened to go home. Ms. Delaney's voice carried a sense of urgency, and Oliver could hear her gather her things while still on the phone. She promised she would meet them back at the school, in the main office, and call Mr. Carson too. Oliver ended the call and turned to Ethan. "We'll head back to the school, okay?" Oliver said, trying to sound as soothing as he could. "Ms. Delaney wants to see you. We'll figure this out." Ethan looked out the bus window as Oliver restarted the engine. The sky had darkened further, and the first drops of rain splattered on the glass. The roads were quiet except for a few cars and the hum of distant traffic. The ride felt longer than it was, punctuated by the squeak of the windshield wipers as they cleared the drizzle. All the while, Ethan was battling the swirl of fear and faint hope inside him. He couldn't help wondering if, by seeking help, he was only going to make things worse when he had to face Greg and Melissa again. Eventually, Oliver maneuvered the big yellow bus back into the school parking lot. True to her word, Ms. Delaney stood outside the lit entrance of the building, her arms crossed protectively over her chest as she braved the light rain. She rushed to the bus as soon as it parked, stepping inside and calling softly to Ethan. "Ethan, sweetheart, why don't you come with me into the office?" she said, using the same gentle voice she reserved for anxious students. "Mr. Carson is on his way. We're going to help you. You don't have to be scared." Ethan's eyes flickered between Oliver and Ms. Delaney, as though he wasn't sure who to trust more. He slowly picked up his backpack and walked down the aisle. Ms. Delaney put a warm hand on his shoulder, and for once, he did not jerk away. Whether it was exhaustion or the faint spark of faith in her words, he allowed her to guide him into the school building. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed in the empty corridors. Their footsteps echoed on the polished floors, forming an eerie contrast to the typical daytime hustle. Ms. Delaney led Ethan to the main office, where the secretary's desk lamp was still on, casting a warm glow on the otherwise dim space. She offered Ethan a seat in a cushioned chair, then excused herself for a moment, stepping aside to talk quietly with Oliver. They spoke in hushed tones, their eyes frequently darting back to where Ethan sat, looking small and out of place in the adult setting. A few minutes later, Mr. Carson arrived. A tall man in his mid-30s, with an athletic build and a calm demeanor, he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence. His gentle smile could put students at ease, especially the ones who were struggling. He approached Ethan with careful step. "Hey, buddy," he said in a calm, reassuring tone, "you remember me, right? I'm Mr. Carson, your PE teacher." Ethan nodded, his gaze fixed on his shoelaces. Mr. Carson knelt in front of him, keeping enough distance so Ethan wouldn't feel cornered. "Ms. Delaney told me you're having a tough time. I want you to know it's okay to talk to us," Mr. Carson continued. "We're all here to help." Ethan squeezed the straps of his backpack. He felt the ache in his arms where fresh bruises had formed. "I can't," he said. His voice cracked on the second word. "If I do, it'll be worse." Mr. Carson glanced at Ms. Delaney, who had tears brimming in her eyes. She was a teacher who had devoted her entire career to nurturing children, and seeing Ethan's distress was nearly unbearable. "You won't have to go back there tonight, okay?" Ms. Delaney promised softly. "At least let's call Ms. Rowan. She's the social worker, remember? She's good at helping kids in tough situations. She can tell us what to do next." Ethan nodded, though the gesture was barely perceptible. A spark of relief flickered inside him. Maybe he wouldn't have to face Greg and Melissa tonight. Maybe, just maybe, he could escape their rage for at least one day. He clung to that sliver of hope like a lifeline. Ms. Delaney slipped into the office behind them and picked up the phone. She left a quick message for Ms. Rowan, trusting that the social worker would call back the instant she heard the words "urgent" and "child in need." While they waited, Mr. Carson and Oliver tried to make light conversation with Ethan, asking him about his day, if he had any hobbies, favorite classes, but their attempts fell flat. Ethan's responses came out in monosyllables. The tension in his hunched shoulders never fully eased. When Ms. Rowan finally called back, Ms. Delaney stepped aside to take the call privately, explaining the situation as succinctly as she could. She spoke in low, urgent tones, describing the bruise Oliver saw, Ethan's fear, and his reluctance to go home. A few minutes later, Ms. Delaney returned to the group, her brow still furrowed with concern. "Ms. Rowan is on her way," she said. "She told us to sit tight, keep Ethan safe, and not let him out of our sight." Ethan stared at the tiled floor. The silence around him felt heavy, punctuated by the rhythmic ticking of the office clock. He wondered what Greg was doing at that moment. Would he come storming into the school, demanding to know why Ethan was late? The very thought made the boy's heart hammer in his chest. He half expected to see the door fling open and hear Greg's thunderous footsteps any second. But time passed without incident. The only interruption was the sound of an arriving car pulling into the parking lot. Moments later, Ms. Rowan entered the school, shaking off droplets of rain from her coat. She was a trim woman in her early 40s, her dark hair cut into a neat bob that framed sharp, intelligent eyes. She carried herself with a purposeful stride. "Hello, Ethan," Ms. Rowan said, approaching him with a kind smile and a careful distance. "I'm Ms. Rowan, the social worker here. Do you remember me from orientation day?" Ethan nodded, faint recognition in his eyes. He had seen her once in the hallway, greeting students and handing out pamphlets about school resources. Back then, he had been too afraid to talk to her or anyone, but he remembered her calm demeanor. Ms. Rowan gently drew up a chair beside him. She placed a manila folder on the desk, but didn't open it. "I hear you're worried about going home," she said. "That's all right. We want to keep you safe. Do you feel safe here?" Ethan managed a slight shrug, but there was a tiny spark of gratitude in his eyes. He spoke quietly. "I just don't want to be there anymore." "I understand," Ms. Rowan said. "Sometimes, when you're scared or hurt at home, you can feel like you have no choices. But I promise we have ways to help. We can make sure you don't go back to a place that hurts you. Can you tell me more about why you're scared?" Ethan drew a shaky breath, but then the words locked up inside him again. He couldn't do it. He couldn't risk it. The memory of Greg's stern face was all too vivid. "It's okay," Ms. Rowan reassured him. "Take your time. You don't have to say anything until you're ready." For a few minutes, she spoke in a soft, soothing voice, asking gentle questions that didn't pry too deeply. She asked about Ethan's favorite sport, if he liked reading, if he had friends at school. Each question was a subtle opening for him to reveal more. Ethan answered politely, but his words were stilted. It was clear that a part of him yearned to confess everything, but fear held him back. After some time, Ms. Rowan decided to approach it differently. She turned to Ms. Delaney and Mr. Carson. "We should get some documentation," she said. "If Ethan isn't comfortable talking yet, we can at least note the bruise on his arm, and any other injuries he might have. We can have our staff nurse come and do a gentle check. That might help us see the bigger picture." Oliver, who had been quietly observing, gently spoke to Ethan. "We're not trying to push you, but this might be important if you ever decide you want to talk about what's going on. We need to know the truth so we can stop it." Ethan exhaled a shaky breath and gave a small nod. It felt surreal, letting these people see him at his most vulnerable. But maybe, somewhere in his child's heart, he recognized that this was the help he needed. The school nurse, Mrs. Ramirez, arrived soon after. She walked in with a sympathetic smile, her footsteps soft. She had seen many injuries in her time, but she was always gentle with children who looked frightened. She asked Ethan for permission to check him over, promising not to do anything that hurt. Ethan gave a small nod and allowed her to roll up his sleeves. More bruises became visible, some fading to a yellowish tinge, others more recent, dark and swollen. The collective tension in the room escalated as Ms. Delaney's eyes moistened, Mr. Carson's jaw tightened, and Oliver pursed his lips in concern. Mrs. Ramirez didn't say much as she made her notes. She simply documented the pattern of marks. "You've been through a lot, haven't you, honey?" she said softly to Ethan. He lowered his gaze, unable to respond. Once Mrs. Ramirez finished, Ms. Rowan turned to Ethan. "Would you like to stay somewhere else tonight?" she asked, her tone filled with understanding. "Somewhere that isn't your foster parents' house?" Ethan's nod this time was more immediate, though fear still lingered in his eyes. "We'll have to contact Child Protective Services and let them know what's happening," Ms. Rowan explained gently. "They might place you in a temporary home or a shelter until we figure things out. Is that all right with you, Ethan?" He didn't speak, but the relief in his eyes was answer enough. For the rest of the evening, Ms. Rowan made the necessary phone calls. Ms. Delaney and Mr. Carson stayed close by, as did Oliver, refusing to leave until they were sure Ethan would be taken care of. Ethan's fear seemed to ease just a fraction, realizing that, at least for tonight, he wouldn't be forced to go back to the Harpers. Yet, even as the relief began to filter through him, Ethan couldn't ignore the niggling voice in his mind that warned of consequences. Greg and Melissa had a way of twisting events so that they appeared blameless. They were adept at wearing courteous smiles for the outside world, only revealing their true selves behind closed doors. He felt the dread creep back into his stomach, knowing it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. CPS arrived near midnight. A tired-looking woman with kind eyes introduced herself as Ms. Lee. She shook Ms. Rowan's hand and exchanged a few words before approaching Ethan with a caring nod. "It's been a long night for you," Ms. Lee said gently. "Let's get you to a safe place, all right?" Ethan stood, looking uncertainly at Mr. Carson and Ms. Delaney. He gave them each a timid glance. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice cracking slightly with emotion. Ms. Delaney nodded, tears threatening to spill. "Of course, sweetie. We'll see you soon, okay? We'll make sure everything gets better." Mr. Carson placed a warm hand on Ethan's shoulder, offering a comforting squeeze. "You're not alone," he said. "Remember that." As Ms. Lee led Ethan away, Ms. Rowan explained that there would be a formal investigation into the Harpers. Nothing was confirmed yet, but the signs pointed to a serious situation of abuse. Oliver rubbed his temple, exhaling heavily. "I saw this bruise," he murmured, his voice laced with quiet anger. "I knew this boy was scared out of his mind. I just hope we got to him in time." Little did they all know, this was only the beginning of a grueling journey. The coming days would reveal more layers to the Harpers' control, more bruises, physical and emotional, that Ethan carried under the surface. It would stretch the patience and resolve of every adult involved, testing their dedication to seeing justice done, and pushing Ethan to find a courage he didn't even know he had. That night, Ethan was placed in a small children's shelter, with a bunk and a single dresser for his belongings. It was a stark environment. The walls were painted a soft blue, and there were a few posters of cartoon characters to brighten the space, but it still felt institutional. Ethan lay awake, listening to the distant hum of traffic and the soft murmurs of other children who couldn't sleep. He felt the ache of loneliness seep into him. Even if Greg and Melissa were cruel, they had been the only semblance of a home he had. Now, he was in a place filled with strangers. The next morning, Ms. Rowan, Ms. Delaney, and Mr. Carson all met to discuss the situation. Ms. Rowan had visited the Harpers first thing in the morning to assess the household, though it was mostly a formality. Greg and Melissa had greeted her with polite civility, wearing worried expressions that suggested they had no clue why Ethan hadn't come home. They claimed they had been worried sick when he didn't arrive. Ms. Rowan, of course, noticed the small details. The way Melissa fidgeted whenever Ms. Rowan asked pointed questions, or the subtle shift in Greg's voice when his patience wore thin. Still, without Ethan's explicit testimony, Ms. Rowan had only the physical evidence of bruises and her own intuition. The Harpers offered plausible explanations. "He's clumsy," they said, "always tripping on the sidewalk. He fell off his bike a few days ago." They insisted they loved Ethan and just wanted him home. Ms. Rowan felt a wave of unease as she listened. She wasn't naive. She had heard such excuses countless times, always from adults claiming innocence while the children suffered. She left the house with a forced smile, but her notes reflected her deep concerns. At school, Ms. Delaney and Mr. Carson struggled to concentrate on their classes that day. Their minds drifted to Ethan's plight. At lunch, they met in the empty staff lounge, trays of barely touched food in front of them. Ms. Delaney sighed, stirring her coffee absently. "I can't stop thinking about him," Ms. Delaney admitted. "He looked so scared. What if the system fails him?" Mr. Carson frowned, recalling every moment he had seen Ethan flinch or shy away from even casual contact. "We have to trust Ms. Rowan and CPS," he said. "We'll do our part too. If they need testimony about what we've seen, any suspicious marks or behavior, I'll do anything to help." Ms. Delaney nodded. "We should gather everything, even the smallest details. If it helps keep him away from that house, it's worth it." They decided they would start documenting every incident, every bruise, every odd behavior Ethan had displayed over the past few months. They informed Oliver as well, who agreed to add his own observations. Together, they started compiling an informal record that might one day become valuable evidence, if Ethan ever decided, or was able, to speak out. Meanwhile, at the children's shelter, Ethan spent his day in a room with a social worker who tried to coax him into conversation. He responded with polite shrugs and short answers. Later that afternoon, Ms. Rowan arrived to check on him. She asked if he felt comfortable speaking about anything he might have experienced. Ethan remained silent, eyes lowered. It pained him to see Ms. Rowan's gentle face, full of concern, and to know he was failing her by not uttering the words she needed to hear. But how could he speak them? How could he put voice to the memory of Greg's stern hand clamping onto his arm, or the withheld meals when he didn't do his chores perfectly? He had learned so well to stay silent. He had been told that no one would believe him, or that if he said anything, he would be taken away to an even worse place. And for a child who had bounced around foster homes before, the fear of the unknown was as paralyzing as the fear of the known. Yet Ms. Rowan's patience was infinite. She offered him a small notebook. "If you don't feel like talking, you can draw or write about your feelings," she said. "No one will read it unless you want them to." Ethan stared at the blank pages. He thought about the swirl of images in his head, images of fists, glares, nights alone in his room crying silently into his pillow. But he couldn't bring himself to transcribe them onto paper. Instead, he closed the notebook quietly, placing it beside him. That evening, Ms. Lee, the CPS worker who had taken him from the school, came by the shelter. She sat down with Ethan, trying a different approach. She explained gently that if he wanted to stay away from Greg and Melissa for good, she would need more than just an unspoken fear. "Sometimes," she said, "we need you to say what happened. Or at least tell us enough so we know you're not safe. You deserve a safe place to live, Ethan." Ethan wanted to speak. He wanted to scream the truth. But every time he opened his mouth, he imagined Greg's piercing glare, the sharp words about what would happen if he turned them in. So, he remained silent. Days turned into a week. During that time, Ms. Rowan and Ms. Delaney visited him, bringing small gifts, books, coloring supplies, in hopes he would open up. Mr. Carson even popped by to see how Ethan was doing. He softly told Ethan that he believed in him, that he wasn't going to give up on him. Ethan appreciated their care, but the shadows of his nightmares still loomed large. Meanwhile, the Harpers kept up their polite facade. They cooperated with every request from CPS, attending interviews and letting the social workers inspect their home. They played the part of concerned parents, lamenting that they missed Ethan terribly and wanted him to come home. Their performance was convincing enough to sow doubt among some officials. After all, children in foster care sometimes came with psychological or behavioral issues. Could the boy be exaggerating, or worse, fabricating the abuse? Ms. Rowan, however, refused to let the matter drop. She pushed for thorough checks, pointing out the pattern of bruises, the fear Ethan exhibited. But without a clear statement from Ethan, everything remained in a painful limbo. Despite Ms. Rowan's best efforts, the bureaucracy of the system often needed direct evidence or a child's testimony to instigate more decisive action. Then, a turning point came almost 2 weeks later. Ethan arrived at the school from the shelter, escorted by Ms. Lee, to keep some semblance of routine in his life. The system believed that continuing his education was crucial, so they arranged for him to attend Stratford Academy under supervised transportation. That morning, Ms. Delaney immediately sensed something was off. Ethan seemed even more withdrawn than usual, as though he was bracing for a harsh blow. During second period, she noticed him holding his side as though in pain. She took him aside. "Ethan," she said gently, "are you hurt?" He shook his head, but she noticed the grimace he tried to hide. Acting on instinct, she called the school nurse again. Mrs. Ramirez made a quick examination and found fresh bruises along his torso. This time, there were no bike fall excuses. Ethan had been at the shelter, presumably safe. Ms. Ramirez and Ms. Delaney were horrified. They suspected that someone at the shelter might have hurt him, or perhaps Ethan had harmed himself in some other way. But Ethan remained silent, adding another layer of mystery and concern. Ms. Rowan was informed immediately. She questioned the staff at the shelter, who insisted they had never seen any signs of new bruises, nor had Ethan reported any incidents. The staff was scrutinized, but nothing pointed to wrongdoing there. Ms. Rowan felt her concern multiply. She wondered if the boy was slipping into such a state of stress that he might be injuring himself, or if someone had followed him or threatened him. The situation was becoming more complex than she had initially realized. As all this unfolded, Mr. Carson watched Ethan from a distance. In PE class, Ethan tried to follow instructions for the day's mild exercise, but he was obviously in discomfort. Mr. Carson blew his whistle gently, calling Ethan over. "You're not feeling up to this, are you?" he asked softly. Ethan lowered his eyes. "I'm fine," he mumbled, though the strain in his voice betrayed him. "Here, sit with me for a moment," Mr. Carson said, guiding him to a bench at the side of the gym. The rest of the class played a simple basketball drill. Mr. Carson sat beside Ethan, speaking quietly so the other students wouldn't overhear. "You know, I used to have a student who was real quiet, just like you," he said. "He was dealing with some tough stuff at home. It took him a long time to open up. But when he did, we were able to help him. He didn't have to live in fear anymore." Ethan stared at the polished wood floor. The squeak of sneakers and the thump of the basketball echoed around them. For a moment, Mr. Carson thought Ethan wouldn't respond. Then the boy's voice came in a trembling hush. If I tell, they'll hate me. They said it would be worse than anything if I betrayed them." Mr. Carson's pulse quickened. It was the most Ethan had said about his situation thus far. "Listen, Ethan," he said. "The Harpers have no right to hurt you or to make you feel like you're doing something wrong by telling the truth. People who care about you will do everything to keep you safe." Ethan's eyes darted up, shimmering with tears he fought to hold back. "But the system never keeps anyone forever," he whispered. "I'll just go from one house to another, and they'll find me. They'll get me somehow." It was a heartbreaking statement, a reminder that Ethan had been bounced around from foster home to foster home, always feeling rootless and vulnerable. Mr. Carson's own chest tightened at those words. He realized in that moment just how deep Ethan's wounds ran, not only from physical violence but also from the emotional upheaval of a life with no true stability. "We won't let that happen," Mr. Carson assured him, though he knew it was a complex promise in a complex system. "You have more people looking out for you now, Ms. Delaney, Ms. Rowan, me, and Oliver. We're going to do whatever it takes to keep you safe." Ethan nodded, but uncertainty clouded his eyes. Still, it was a step. A small one, but a step nonetheless. Over the next week, tension mounted as CPS deliberated. Greg and Melissa Harper, through their lawyer, lodged a complaint that the school and the social worker were overstepping by keeping Ethan away from them. They demanded Ethan be returned. They produced photos of their immaculate home, references from neighbors who found them cordial and involved, and insisted the bruises were either self-inflicted or the product of accidents that Ethan was prone to. The drama escalated behind closed conference doors, phone lines, and administrative offices. Ms. Rowan fought tirelessly, citing Ethan's visible terror, the pattern of injuries, and the professional testimonies of Ms. Delaney, Mr. Carson, Oliver, and Mrs. Ramirez. Eventually, the evidence swayed CPS enough to keep Ethan from returning to the Harpers indefinitely, pending a formal hearing. During that time, Ethan remained at the shelter. While not ideal, it was deemed safer than returning to a potentially abusive home. Yet the shelter environment weighed on Ethan. Children came and went, often with stories of their own troubles. It was a place of transience, and that sense of impermanence gnawed at Ethan's already fragile sense of security. Late at night, when the others were asleep, he would sometimes slip out of bed and stare at the moon through the window, wishing for a life that felt normal. Wishing he had a real home where he could wake up and not fear the day ahead. One evening, overwhelmed by it all, Ethan decided he couldn't stay. The fear of the Harpers hung over him like a dark specter, and the constant rotations of staff and children made him feel more isolated. He slipped out through a side door, stepping into the chilly night. He was small enough to dart past the limited security lights, and the staff was temporarily distracted with another child who was having a meltdown. He found himself on the street, a backpack slung over his shoulder, with no plan other than to keep walking. He just knew he couldn't go back to that shelter. He was done being shuffled around like a forgotten package. The city streets at night were far from comforting. Cars whipped by, headlights glaring. The sidewalk glistened with the sheen of a recent rain. Ethan's heart pounded as he clutched his backpack straps, heading nowhere in particular. He only hoped that by keeping moving, he could outrun his circumstances. He had walked for nearly 2 hours, aimlessly wandering through dimly lit neighborhoods, when exhaustion finally set in. His feet ached, and his stomach growled with hunger. Shivering, he sought refuge in a recessed doorway of a closed hardware store. He hunched there, fighting back tears and wishing he was a bird that could fly far away. The night wore on, and he drifted in and out of a fitful doze, the cold seeping into his bones. Morning arrived with a pale, gray light. With it came a renewed pang of hunger and the realization that he had no real direction. He trudged along the sidewalks, hoping to find something, maybe a park or a place he could rest without attracting too much attention. People walked by, some throwing curious looks at the disheveled boy, but none stopped to ask if he was all right. Fate intervened, or perhaps it was just a small miracle, when a familiar voice called out, "Ethan? Ethan, is that you?" He looked up to see Mr. Carson stepping out of a small diner, holding a cup of coffee. The man's expression shifted from surprise to deep concern in the space of a heartbeat. "My God, Ethan," Mr. Carson said, hurrying over, "what are you doing out here?" Ethan staggered back, tears welling up in his eyes again. I had to go," he mumbled, voice trembling. "I can't be in that shelter anymore. I don't have anywhere to go." Mr. Carson quickly guided Ethan away from the busy street, not caring that his coffee was still in hand. He set the cup down on a nearby ledge and took off his light jacket, draping it around Ethan's shoulders. "You're freezing," he said, alarm evident in his voice. "Come on, let's get you inside. We'll figure something out." Ethan let Mr. Carson steer him back into the diner. The warmth of the place, both in temperature and the smell of breakfast food, washed over him like a gentle embrace. Mr. Carson settled him into a booth, then rushed to the counter to request a hot meal. When he returned, he slipped into the seat across from Ethan, eyeing him with a mix of relief and worry. "I was just grabbing breakfast before heading to the school," Mr. Carson explained. "I can't believe I found you out here. You must have been so scared." Ethan wrapped his small hands around the mug of hot chocolate the server brought over. I can't do it anymore," he whispered. "I don't want to keep going to different places. And I can't testify against Greg and Melissa. I don't want to even think about them. I'm so tired." Mr. Carson felt a surge of protectiveness toward the boy. "I understand," he said gently. "But you can't stay on the streets. That's dangerous, Ethan." "I know," Ethan said softly, tears brimming. "But I just had to get out." Mr. Carson sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He had been thinking about Ethan constantly ever since the bus incident. He couldn't bear the thought of leaving Ethan to the cyclical uncertainty of the foster system if there was a way to help. Yet he also knew that deciding to take Ethan in wasn't a simple matter. There were legal and personal ramifications. Still, as he looked at the shivering child, lost and terrified, he made a decision. "Listen," he said, "I'm going to call Ms. Rowan and let her know I found you. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to see if I can foster you myself, at least temporarily. That way, you'll have a safe place with someone you know. I can't promise you it'll be easy, but I promise you won't have to face this alone." Ethan blinked in disbelief. You want to foster me?" he asked, voice trembling. Mr. Carson nodded, eyes full of genuine compassion. "Yes, if that's something you'd want, and if CPS agrees. I can't stand the thought of you being alone or going back to the Harpers." Ethan's eyes filled with tears, but this time there was a spark of relief mingled with overwhelming gratitude. "Yes, please," he whispered, hardly daring to believe this could happen. Mr. Carson reached across the table and gently squeezed Ethan's hand. "Finish your breakfast," he said with a gentle smile. "Then we'll contact Ms. Rowan. We'll figure out all the paperwork, one step at a time." Ethan nodded, still trembling slightly, but now a flicker of hope lit his features. He took small bites of the scrambled eggs and toast, his stomach still in knot. 1,000 questions whirled in his mind. Would Mr. Carson really be allowed to foster him? How long would it last? Would Greg and Melissa somehow come after him? But for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of safety in the moment, a sense that maybe there was a future where he wasn't just bouncing from place to place, bracing himself for more pain. The days that followed were a whirlwind. Ms. Rowan and CPS had to conduct a home visit to Mr. Carson's apartment to ensure it met all requirements. Mr. Carson poured his heart into proving he could be a responsible guardian, from showing his stable job as a teacher to rearranging his spare room to create a welcoming space for Ethan. Eventually, the approval came through, though it was temporary at first. All parties agreed that Ethan's emotional well-being might be best served in a stable environment where he felt safe. Moving in with Mr. Carson was a big transition for Ethan. He had never seen his PE teacher's home before. It was modest but cozy. A small living room with a comfortable couch, a bookshelf full of novels and sports biographies, and a kitchen that smelled faintly of roasted coffee. In the spare room, Mr. Carson had placed a new bed and some shelves with a few donated toys and books. Ethan hovered in the doorway, feeling a mix of gratitude and wariness. "Go ahead," Mr. Carson encouraged him gently. "This is your space now." Ethan slowly stepped inside, running his fingertips across the bedding. He turned around to face Mr. Carson. "Thank you," he said, voice quiet but sincere. Mr. Carson smiled, though there was a hint of sadness in his eyes. I'm just glad you have somewhere to call your own for a while. The first few nights, Ethan struggled to sleep. He would lie awake, listening to the unfamiliar creaks of the apartment building, hyper-alert to any sound that might signal danger. Once or twice, he awoke from nightmares, heart pounding. Mr. Carson, alerted by the boy's cries, would come in, gently sit on the edge of the bed, and offer whatever reassurance he could. "It's all right," Mr. Carson would say softly, placing a comforting hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." Gradually, with each passing day, Ethan eased into his new life. He went to school with less fear clinging to him. Ms. Delaney noticed he was more present in class, even managing a shy smile now and then. Oliver, the bus driver, gave him a discreet thumbs up whenever Ethan boarded the bus, relieved that the boy seemed to be in a safer situation. Of course, there was still the matter of the court proceedings against the Harpers. Ms. Rowan informed Ethan that, eventually, he would need to speak to a judge or a counselor about what had happened. The Harpers were pushing back through their lawyer, claiming their innocence. For a while, Ethan remained unwilling to testify. The memory of their threats still loomed large in his mind. Every time Ms. Rowan broached the subject, Ethan's voice would falter, and he'd retreat inward, shaking his head in silence. Weeks turned into months, and the official hearing drew closer. The knowledge weighed heavily on Ethan. If he couldn't speak up, there was a chance the Harpers might regain custody or at least have some influence over his future. Mr. Carson, Ms. Delaney, Oliver, and Ms. Rowan all tried to bolster his courage, but they knew the final decision was his. No one could force a child to testify. It had to come from him. As the court date approached, Ethan grew more anxious. He started having nightmares again. One night, he awoke drenched in sweat, tears streaming down his face. Mr. Carson rushed into the room, finding Ethan curled in a ball, gasping for breath. "It's all right, Ethan," Mr. Carson said gently. "You're safe here. Nobody can hurt you." Ethan looked up at Mr. Carson, tears still glistening in his eyes. "They said, I have to speak in court," he whispered. "I'm so scared." Mr. Carson settled beside him, wrapping an arm around the trembling boy. "I know," he said softly. "It's scary. But think about it. If you say what really happened, we can make sure they never hurt you or any other kid again. You can be free." Ethan sniffled, leaning into the warmth of Mr. Carson's embrace. "What if they don't believe me?" Mr. Carson paused, choosing his words carefully. "I can't promise you how it will go, but I can promise you that you have a lot of people who do believe you. Ms. Delaney, Oliver, Ms. Rowan, me, we've got your back. And there's all the evidence of your bruises, the times you were afraid. Trust me, Ethan, people will listen." The day of the hearing arrived like a dark cloud hanging over everyone involved. Ethan wore a simple button-down shirt, his hair neatly combed by Mr. Carson in an attempt to make him look and feel as presentable as possible. The courthouse was a tall, imposing building with marble floors that echoed with each footstep. Ethan felt his heart pounding. Ms. Rowan met them in the lobby, giving Ethan a gentle smile and ushering him to a quieter waiting area. Greg and Melissa Harper were already there, dressed in conservative, tidy outfit. They looked the picture of respectable foster parents, smiling stiffly at everyone who passed, as though they were the real victims of a misunderstanding. Occasionally, their gaze would flick to Ethan, and a subtle tension appeared in their eyes. Ethan shrank away, hiding slightly behind Mr. Carson's arm. In the courtroom, the judge, a stern-faced woman with a measured tone, went through the formalities. The Harpers' lawyer argued that Ethan was a troubled child who had fabricated stories to gain attention. He cited the boy's tendency to be silent and suggested that the bruises had innocent explanations or were self-inflicted. Ms. Rowan, representing Ethan's interests, countered with the documented evidence of repeated bruises, the testimonies of teachers who noticed Ethan's fear, and Oliver's statement about that pivotal day on the bus. Still, all eyes turned to Ethan. The judge asked if he would be willing to speak about his experience. He froze, his voice catching in his throat. Melissa Harper watched him, her eyes narrowing ever so slightly, an unspoken threat dancing there. For a moment, Ethan felt the weight of those old terrors. He wanted to run, to bolt out of the courtroom and never look back. But then he felt a hand on his shoulder, Mr. Carson, standing behind him, silently supporting him. He remembered that day in the diner when Mr. Carson found him, the unwavering concern in Ms. Delaney's voice, and Oliver's vow that no one would hurt him on his watch. He remembered Ms. Rowan, who had tried so patiently to protect him from going back to that house. All these people cared, and they believed in him. His heart hammered in his chest, but he forced himself to step forward. He stood before the judge, feet trembling, and in a quiet but resolute voice he said, "They hurt me." It was only 3 words, but they shattered the tension in the room. The hush was absolute, broken only by the click of someone's pen dropping to the floor. The judge leaned forward, indicating that Ethan could continue. Ethan took another breath, tears threatening to spill. He glanced momentarily at Greg and Melissa, who stared back at him with tight-lipped shock. "They would grab me," Ethan continued, his voice wavering but gaining strength, and sometimes lock me in my room with no food. If I got anything wrong, they'd hurt me. I didn't want to go back. Ever." A tear slipped down his cheek, but he kept speaking, spurred on by the relief of finally letting it out. "I tried to hide it, 'cause they told me no one would believe me. But my teachers believed me, and the bus driver believed me, and Ms. Rowan believed me, and Mr. Carson believed me too." He stopped, his small shoulders quivering with emotion. The judge asked a few clarifying questions, and Ethan answered as best he could. Even in his trembling voice there was sincerity. It was enough to tip the scales definitively. The Harpers' lawyer tried to regain ground, questioning Ethan's credibility, but the heartbreak in the boy's eyes and the corroboration of his bruises told a more compelling story than any well-polished argument. By the end of that hearing, the judge declared that Greg and Melissa Harper would not be allowed near Ethan, and formal charges against them would proceed. Ethan clung to Mr. Carson's hand as they left the courtroom, tears still streaming, but he felt a wave of relief so profound it almost left him dizzy. He had stood up for himself. He had told the truth. For a time, it seemed as though Ethan could finally breathe again. But the echoes of the Harpers' presence lingered, especially late at night when he recalled their threats. Mr. Carson tried to reassure him, going over safety protocols, making sure the apartment was secure. Ms. Rowan arranged for therapy sessions, believing that Ethan needed professional help to process his trauma and learn to trust again. The days passed, and Ethan slowly began to feel more settled. He still occasionally jumped at sudden noises, but he looked forward to school, even enjoying aspects of PE class as he discovered he was fairly good at dodgeball. Ms. Delaney would ask how he was doing, praising him when he completed assignments with newfound confidence. Oliver gave him encouraging waves whenever he boarded the bus. Life, for the first time, felt like it was heading toward normalcy. But then, one night, approximately 2.5 weeks after the hearing, the unthinkable happened. Mr. Carson had stayed up late grading student reports, while Ethan was asleep in his room. The apartment was quiet. The city lights shimmered outside the window, and a gentle breeze ruffled the curtains. Suddenly, the front door rattled. Mr. Carson shot to his feet in alarm, confusion giving way to panic as the door burst open. Standing there, glaring with wild eyes, was Greg Harper. "Where is he?" Greg spat, voice low and menacing. Melissa stood slightly behind him, her face twisted with determination. Without waiting for an answer, Greg shoved Mr. Carson aside with surprising force. Mr. Carson stumbled into a chair, pain jolting through his shoulder. "You can't be here." Mr. Carson gasped. "Get out, or I'm calling the police." Greg glowered, stepping forward. "You think a judge can keep us from our kid? You stole him from us," he snarled. "We'll take him back, and there's nothing you can do about it." Ethan, awakened by the commotion, peeked out of his room. Terror seized him at the sight of Greg and Melissa in the apartment. He tried to back away, but Melissa caught his arm, hissing under her breath, "You're coming with us." Mr. Carson scrambled to intervene, but Greg blocked him, delivering a swift, brutal hit to Mr. Carson's side that made him double over. "Don't you dare," Greg growled, "or you'll regret it." They dragged Ethan out of the apartment, ignoring his frantic pleas. In a matter of seconds, they had forced him into a vehicle parked outside. Mr. Carson, disoriented from the blow, stumbled to the phone to call for help. As he dialed 911, he felt a surge of desperation. The Harpers had abducted Ethan, and if they managed to get far, who knew what they might do? The police arrived quickly, but not quickly enough to stop the Harpers. An alert was put out for the vehicle. Ms. Rowan was notified, and soon a larger multi-state search commenced. The fear that Greg would inflict unspeakable harm on Ethan gripped everyone who cared about the boy. As the days stretched on with no immediate leads, anxiety mounted to a fever pitch. Ethan's ordeal during those 4 days was harrowing beyond what he had ever experienced. Greg and Melissa kept him confined in a rundown motel room out of state, forcibly shushing him whenever he cried. Melissa tried to soothe him with sweet words, only to lash out with scorn moments later. Greg paced, seething with anger at the system that had dared to take Ethan away from him. He threatened Ethan repeatedly, telling him that if he made any noise or tried to escape, there would be dire consequences. Ethan, traumatized and exhausted, retreated into near-silent compliance. He barely slept, certain that if he closed his eyes, Greg might lunge at him. Food was scarce, and the smell of stale cigarettes in the motel room clung to him. Time blurred. Every hour felt like an eternity. On the 4th day, the authorities received an anonymous tip about a couple matching Greg and Melissa's description. The tip pointed them to a dingy motel near the state border. Local law enforcement coordinated with federal agents, and they converged on the location quietly. They cleared out the other guests under various pretexts, preparing to confront Greg and Melissa without endangering bystanders. Inside the room, Ethan was curled up on the edge of one of the beds, knees drawn to his chest. Greg was ranting under his breath about how the entire world was against him. Melissa tried to calm him, but her words were laced with the same bitterness. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Greg froze, exchanging a frightened glance with Melissa. Then a voice called out, "Management, need to check something about your reservation." Ethan's heart pounded. It felt like a trick. Greg gave him a menacing glare and yanked him off the bed, whispering, "Don't make a sound." But the next moment the door burst open. Law enforcement officers rushed in. Greg, in a wild, desperate motion, tried to pull Ethan in front of him, as though he might use the boy as leverage to escape. Ethan yelped in terror. Before Greg could tighten his grip, an FBI agent charged forward, grappling Greg and forcing him to release Ethan. Greg fought back, but he was quickly overpowered. Melissa, screaming in protest, was also restrained. Ethan stood there, shaking, tears blurring his vision. Another agent approached him gently. "It's okay," the agent said. "You're safe now." Ethan sobbed, relief pouring out in uncontrollable waves. He barely understood what was happening as he was led outside, where paramedics checked him for injuries. The night air was cool against his tear-streaked face, and he watched as Greg and Melissa were taken away in handcuffs, their furious voices drowned out by the rush of law enforcement activity. Within hours, Ethan was on his way back, escorted by caring officials. Mr. Carson had never stopped pacing since the kidnapping, subsisting on minimal sleep and unending worry. When Ethan arrived home, escorted by Ms. Rowan, Mr. Carson practically sprinted to the car, pulling the boy into a protective embrace. "I'm so sorry," Mr. Carson whispered, voice trembling with emotion. "I should have protected you better." Ethan, still in a state of shock, clung to Mr. Carson, tears soaking into the man's shirt. He didn't have the words to explain how grateful he was just to see a friendly face again. The aftermath was chaotic. Therapists stepped in to help Ethan deal with the trauma of the kidnapping. The Harpers faced charges of kidnapping and child abuse, which ensured they would be incarcerated for a long time. Ms. Rowan visited Ethan daily, coordinating with various agencies to finalize protective measures and confirm that no one could possibly step in on the Harpers' behalf to claim custody. At last, things began to settle. Ethan stayed with Mr. Carson as planned, but now with even stronger protective orders in place. Day by day, the boy began to heal. The nightmares persisted for a while, and he often startled easily, but he wasn't alone. Therapy sessions helped him work through his trauma, and the unwavering support of Mr. Carson, Ms. Delaney, Oliver, and Ms. Rowan offered a scaffolding of hope. By the time the next court date rolled around, this time a final custody hearing for Ethan, he was far more composed. The question of permanent adoption came to the forefront. Could Mr. Carson become Ethan's legal father? Mr. Carson had privately debated this for some time, unsure if he had the emotional bandwidth to be a parent full-time. But after seeing Ethan's struggles, holding him in the aftermath of nightmares, and watching him slowly blossom into a child who could smile again, Mr. Carson realized that he couldn't imagine letting Ethan go anywhere else. The adoption process was its own labyrinth, requiring background checks, financial stability proof, and psychological evaluations. Yet, after months of demonstrations that Mr. Carson provided a nurturing environment, the path was cleared. On the day of the formal adoption, the judge, a different one from the previous hearing, reviewed the final paperwork and nodded with approval. "So," she said, smiling kindly at Ethan, "you're going to be Ethan Carson from now on. Are you okay with that?" Ethan, seated beside Mr. Carson, glanced up at the man he had come to see as a protector and a friend. Tears of joy brimmed in his eyes. "Yes," he answered. "I want that." Mr. Carson reached over and squeezed Ethan's shoulder. "I promise I'll be the best dad I can be," he said softly, emotion coloring his usually steady voice. The gavel sounded softly, and with that, Ethan was no longer a ward of the state. He was, at last, part of a real family, the Carson family. The sense of finality and peace that washed over him felt almost surreal. Ms. Delaney, who had come to witness the occasion, dabbed her eyes. Ms. Rowan and Oliver stood near the back of the courtroom, sharing smiles of relief and triumph. Everyone understood how far Ethan had come, how much he had endured, and how significant this moment was. They stepped outside into the sunny afternoon. Cars whizzed by, and somewhere a group of children laughed. Mr. Carson led Ethan to the car, opening the door for him. Ethan hesitated for a second, looking back at the courthouse. "You okay?" Mr. Carson asked gently. Ethan nodded, managing a heartfelt smile. I didn't think this day would come," he said. "I'm actually safe." Mr. Carson smiled back, eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "Yeah, buddy," he murmured, ruffling Ethan's hair. "You're safe." They returned to the apartment that was no longer just Mr. Carson's place but now Ethan's home as well. Therapy continued, and Ethan found new interests. He began painting, expressing himself through art, capturing both the darkness of his past and the bright possibilities of his future. With each brushstroke, he realized the shadows of his memories grew weaker, replaced by a stronger sense of self-worth. At school, Ms. Delaney noticed the change. Ethan became more talkative, raising his hand in class, even playing with some of the other students at recess. Oliver, still driving his bus route, would see Ethan off every morning with a genuine grin instead of a timid wave. The entire community at Stratford Academy seemed to rally around him, celebrating the transformation of a frightened boy into a courageous, hopeful child. It wasn't a perfect fairy tale. Ethan still struggled with the scars of his past. Certain triggers could set him off, a raised voice, the sound of a door slamming, but each time, Mr. Carson was there to comfort him, reminding him that he was cherished and safe. On a peaceful evening a few weeks after the adoption was finalized, Ethan and Mr. Carson sat on the couch, watching a nature documentary. The warm glow of a table lamp illuminated the small living room. Ethan turned his head to look at Mr. Carson. I just wanted to say, he began softly, thank you for finding me that morning. And for everything else. Mr. Carson smiled and draped an arm around him. You're welcome, Ethan, he said. Having you here has changed my life too, you know. I'm really proud of you. Ethan snuggled closer, feeling a rare sense of belonging. It was a comfort he had never truly known, a feeling that he mattered. With the nightmares receding, the Harpers imprisoned, and a future that included a stable family, Ethan finally felt the darkness loosen its grip. Though the road to healing was long, he wasn't walking it alone. That fact gave him the courage to believe in tomorrow. Thanks for watching till the end. If you enjoyed the story, give this video a like if you haven't already, and subscribe for more.